Hello and welcome back to Geek and Seek, and it's time for another deck tech. So a while ago, Trinket Mage had a collaboration of a bunch of other content creators doing $25 budget decks. This time, that same group of people has organized around building the same commander. As those videos are coming out from all of those people, links to those in the description and the pinned comment of this video. But the commander we all agreed on is Atraxa, Praetor's Voice, because, well, it's the #1 commander and has been for a very long time according to EDH Rec. Originally from Commander 2016, I want to say, it's for a green, a white, a blue, and a black. An Angel Horror Phyrexian that's a 4/4 with flying, vigilance, death touch, and lifelink, and at the beginning of your end step you proliferate. That means you choose any number of permanents and or players, then give each another counter of each kind already there. So yeah, we chose this commander because it's the top commander and it's open-ended. It's no wonder that it's the top commander. With Proliferate, there are so many different kinds of counters in Magic that we can play with. You look here at the top tags here with Atraxa. You got Infect, you got Planeswalkers, you got Phyrexians +1/+1 counters, just generic Proliferate. You go down to more tags, Energy. That's what my old Atraxa deck used to be when I had an Atraxa deck. It was Energy. You also got Sagas. That's cool. Tick through your Sagas faster. There's a lot of really cool things you can do, but as I was kind of going through here, kind of looking for influence on what to do, I noticed that Voltron, only 44 decks. And it got me thinking that I can't not do that. If you've been around this channel for a while, you know that I love Voltron decks. And if you're new, hi, I'm Morgan and I like Voltron decks. Because if you think about it, Atraxa is a decent place to start as a Voltron commander. It already has a decent body. It's a 4/4 for 4 mana with 4 very good keywords. One of the things you have to think about when you're building a Voltron deck is the auras and equipments and other effects that you're putting in your deck to put onto your commander. You're having to dedicate a lot of those slots to putting other keywords on your commander to make it more effective in combat. Atraxa already has a bunch. The flying means that you can get around blockers pretty easily. The vigilance means that after you attack, you can still be on defense. The death touch means that if people are able to block, you're able to start removing those blockers. And the lifelink means that you're going to gain enough life to better protect yourself and buy you more time. Because yeah, Voltron is often associated with aggro, but once it gets to the late game, it gets down to the 1v1, it does get a little bit more complicated. So we like being able to buy ourselves some time. And because we're proliferating, that means we can focus in on things that will increase the aggro a bit. So that's what I decided to do here today. So first of all, we have to acknowledge that the Secret Lair one, it's actually the one I got in paper. This Secret Lair Atraxa is the best one. So if I ever build this deck in paper, this is the version I'm going to use. If you want this deck list too, you can also find that in the description of this video. Before we get into it though, I do need to point out the cards I have in the considering category on Moxfield. There's a few cards in here that are just kind of cool, like there's some protection, there's some tutors, there's a couple cool auras, but most notably we have several cards that care about your auras and equipments. We have Codsworth, we have SRAM, we have Stoneforge Mystic, and while these are great typically in Voltron decks, this final list only ended up with, I think, 6 auras, 7 equipment, something like that. Not as many as you would normally expect. So with that being the case, I'm not convinced that these are worth the deck slots because I'm not sure that SRAM's going to draw us that many cards. Pure Steel Paladin's not going to probably draw us that many cards. I don't know how often the Metalcraft's going to be turned on. Codsworth, it's ramp and it's a way to get auras and equipments on there more easily, but do we actually have enough to make it worth it? I'm not convinced. However, if you are tinkering around with a deck like this, you want to capitalize on this, maybe you find some more auras or equipment that I didn't find in my deck building that you think would make good additions to the deck, then these cards are definitely worth getting in there if you can find a handful more. I just feel like I believe it's like 13 cards or so that fit the auras and equipment description. It just isn't quite enough to put these in there. All right, so let's talk about what we're going to be proliferating with Atraxa. There's 2 main things. One, we're going to do +1/+1 counters. That's going to grow Atraxa, and that means that we're going to be able to get 2 commander damage to kill our opponents much quicker. And then I'm sorry, noobs, we also have a little bit of Infect in here as well. One of my favorite cards in the deck is Lion Sash, which is an artifact creature, but it's also an equipment. This is from Kamigawa. It has reconfigure, so it's either a creature or an equipment if you reconfigure reconfigure it, and it's graveyard hate, so we're responsible Magic players, but as we are exiling permanent cards from graveyards, we are putting +1/+1 counters on it, and then the equipped creature gets +1/+1 for each +1/+1 counter on the Lion Sash. This is also nice because if Atraxa were to die with the Lion Sash on it, the Lion Sash will still survive and just be a creature, so it actually can survive board wipes if it's reconfigured. So that's also kind of nice that we are able to not have to start over in that sense. We also have some equipments that are going to do that. We have Anduril, which is from Lord of the Rings, the like holiday box thing. It says whenever equipped creature attacks, you put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control. If you have the city's blessing, which means you control 10 or more permanents, then you put 2 on each creature instead. We have Bone Sabers, which is for 3 mana, equipped for 3. Equipped creature attacks, you put 4/1/1 counters on it. A new one, this is Lost Jite for 1 mana. It's equipment, which gives you a bunch of flexibility. When it deals combat damage, you put a charge counter on it. You can then remove the charge counter to untap a target land. Target creature can't block this turn, or you put a +1/+1 counter on the equipped creature, which is also nice because the charge counters can also be proliferated. Ozolith the Shattered Spire, which is if we would put a +1/+1 counter on a creature, we put that many +1 instead. Also works with artifacts, so that also works with the Lion Sash, even if it's reconfigured. And then we can pay 1 and a green to tap it to put a +1/+1 counter on a creature or artifact. Also has cycling, sure we'll never do that. And then we also have its father, the Ozolith itself, which is for 1 mana, a artifact that says whenever a creature you control leaves the battlefield, if it had counters on it, you can put those counters onto the Ozolith, and then at the beginning of combat on your turn, you can move the counters from the Ozolith onto another creature. So even if Atraxa is removed, we can kind of keep all those counters that we put all that work into onto the Ozolith, bring it back whenever we get Atraxa or another good threat out. And then there's also Pip-Boy, which is a 1 mana equipment from Fallout. This is whenever a equipped creature attacks, you choose 1, draw and then discard, put a +1/+1 counter on this creature, or you untap up to 2 target lands, which is also just one of my favorite equipments in general. I just love the flexibility on this card, and it's super efficient. Also from Fallout is Power Fist. This is for 1 and a green in equipment that says equipped creature has trample, and whenever this creature deals combat damage to a player, put that many +1/+1 counters on it, which obviously means that this is going to get huge really fast, but also trample is one of the few relevant keywords that Atraxa doesn't have. So if your opponent does have flyers and they're willing to chump block, this is a way that we can still get through in with that damage. While we're talking about trample, we also have Rancor in the deck, which is a 1 mana green aura that says equipped creature gets +2/+0 in trample, and then Rancor kind of just always is going to be accessible to us, minus if it gets exiled, which is if it would be put into your graveyard, we get to return it to our hand instead. Continuing on with +1/+1 counter stuff, we have Forced Adaptation, which is a 1 mana aura that says at the beginning of our upkeep, we put a +1/+1 counter on the enchanted creature. Hadana's Climb is a cool card. This is for 1, a green and a blue, and legendary enchantment. At the beginning of combat on our turn, we put a +1/+1 counter on target creature we control. Then if that creature has 3 or more counters on it, we transform it, and it becomes a land that taps for any color, so great fixing in a 4-color deck. But then also we can pay 1, a green and a blue, tap it, and the target creature gains flying and +X/+X until end of turn, where X is its power. Obviously, we don't really care about giving Atraxa double flying, but the boost in power is also quite nice. Hydra's Growth, which is for 2 and a green, enchant creature, enters the battlefield, put a +1/+1 counter on the enchanted creature, and then at the beginning of our upkeep, we double the amount of +1/+1 counters on the enchanted creatures. Innkeeper's Talent is gain a lot of hype. I love this card. For 1 and a green, at the beginning of combat on our turn, we put a +1/+1 counter on a target creature we control. We can level it up so that permanents we control with counters on them have Ward 1, and then we can level it up again. That doubles the amount of counters we would put on creatures or players. The players is going to be relevant when we talk about Infect here in a bit. And then our last piece of reliable +1/+1 counters is Light of Promise, which is for 2 and a white, an aura that says enchanted creature has whenever we gain life, we put that many +1/+1 counters on this creature, which is great when your creature that you're trying to beat with has lifelink. And then we also talked a little bit about Infect, which, as a reminder, poison is that if a player has 10 poison counters, they lose the game no matter what their life total is. So normally in Commander, you have 40 life. Cool. Well, in Voltron decks, when you're trying to beat down with your commander, it only takes 21 damage. Cool. You go Infect, you only need 10. Even better. So while we're not all in on that, that is kind of our backup plan. We do have a handful of cards that care about poison. Like Infectious Inquiry, which is for 2 and a black sorcery. We draw 2, lose 2. Each opponent gets a poison counter. So it's a card draw spell, but it's going to get the ball rolling in the poison direction. Similarly, there's Prologue to Phyresis, which is for 1 and a blue, an instant that says each opponent gets a poison counter and we draw a card. Probably the most effective one is Tainted Strike, which is for a single black mana instant that says target creature gets +1 +1/+0 and gains infect until end of turn. And then the last one is Phyresis, which is just simply for 1 and a black, the equipped creature has infect. So again, this isn't our main battle plan, mostly just because people don't really like infect, but it is a good way to power up our Voltron deck a little bit, so we do have these few cards in here. So, as you know, if you've ever played a Voltron deck, it's very important that once you got your commander, it gets to stick around. It's very important that we keep this sucker alive, so a ton of our deck is dedicated to protection. We have Bastion Protector, which is a 3/3 for 3 mana that says commanders we control get +2/+2 and indestructible, so boosting up the power is obviously great for commander damage reasons, but also indestructible means it will survive most board wipes and a good chunk of targeted removal. Similarly, there's Guardian Augmenter, which is a 3 mana 2/2 with flash, which is nice because that means we can be tricky with it. That also says commanders we control get +2/+2, but commanders we control have hexproof. So this means that even if our commander's indestructible, they're like, okay, I'll just hit it with my Swords of Plowshare or a Path to Exile. Guardian Augmenter says, nah. We also have Kutzil Malamute Exemplar, which is just a cool card in general. 3 mana 3/3 that says opponents can't cast spells on our turn. That is not the best protection, but there are a lot of times where people would normally say, I'm gonna hold up my interaction. If you come for me, I'll remove it, but if you're going for one of my opponents, I'll let it happen. Kutzil just says, nah, if you're gonna do it, you gotta do it before it's my turn. It's also theoretically going to draw some cards. Shalai Voice of Plenty is a card that I'm kind of on the fence about if it's powerful enough for the deck, but it's a 4 mana 3/4 flyer that says us, planeswalkers we control, we don't have any in the deck, and other creatures we control all have hexproof, so it's protection, but also it has a mana sink for 4 green, so 6 mana. We can put a +1/+1 counter on each creature we control. Then there's Gaia's Gift, which is for 1 and a green, an instant that says we put a +1/+1 counter on the target creature we control, and it gains reach, trample's relevant, hexproof, and indestructible end of turn, so it's just a nice way to protect our commander from almost any situation that could come up. We also have Mutational Advantage, which is for 1, a green, and a blue instant that says permanents we control with counters on them gain hexproof and indestructible until end of turn, prevent all damage that would be dealt to those permanents this turn, and proliferate. Another surefire way for protection. We have Negate, counter target non-creature spell, duh. The one MDFC we have in the deck is Revitalizing Repast, which is for a Golgari hybrid mana, an instant that says put a +1/+1 counter on target creature and it gains indestructible until end of turn. Ripples of Potential, 1 and a blue, instant, proliferate, then choose any number of permanents we control that had counters put on them this way, and those permanents phase out. Simic Charm, kind of an odd one. This is kind of on the chopping board. Notably, it says permanents we control gain hexproof until end of turn. We could also bounce a creature to its owner's hand, so it's removal, get a blocker out of the way if we need. It's also a way if our commander taxes gain high, we can bounce our own Atraxa in response to someone trying to get rid of it, so that way it's cheaper to cast again, or we can boost up finishing someone off fast by giving it +3/+3 until end of turn. Slip Out the Back, which is a 1 mana instant, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature, it phases out. Snakeskin Veil, 1 green mana instant that says put a +1/+1 counter on target creature, and it gains hexproof until end of turn. Teferi's Protection, everyone knows it, I'm not going to read it. We have 2 auras with totem armor, which means that if the creature would be destroyed, instead you just remove that damage and destroy the aura so that the creature doesn't actually die. So we have Bear Umbra, which says equipped creature gets +2/+2, and whenever this creature attacks, untap all lands you control, which is great. It's kind of ramp. Not only does that mean that we get to play things and equip things in our first main phase, but then we'll have mana up for the protection or to keep playing more things. The other one is Snake Umbra, which is a 3 mana aura that says equipped creature gets +1/+1 and has whenever this creature deals combat damage to a player, we may draw a card. Last piece of protection in the deck is Swiftfoot Boots, classic, 2 mana for equipment that says equipped creature has hexproof and haste. Haste is also sometimes relevant. All right, so our commander, it's going to get big and scary, and we're going to be doing a great job at keeping it safe. What else do we have going on in this deck? I'm just going to go by each card type, show off a few things I think are noteworthy. I'm not going to read every card here. Dianetha's pretty cool because it makes our auras and equipment cost less. Again, we don't have that many, but it is a 2/2 with First Strike, Vigilance, Lifelink. God forbid that Atraxa is just locked out of the game. This is a good new target for Voltroning up with, in case Atraxa is completely out of the game for whatever reason. Esper Sentinel, you know it, you hate it. Normally it's only 1, and then when you get to the late game, Esper Sentinel is actually pretty easy to pay for. In this deck, there's a decent chance we're going to be able to put counters on it, make it bigger, harder to pay for the cost. Azuri, Stalker of Spheres, when it enters, we can pay 3 Similarly, if we do, we proliferate twice. I don't know how often that's going to happen, but when we proliferate, we get to draw a card. So it's a great card draw engine for the deck. There's Shauna, Purifying Blade, which is a 3/3 with lifelink, and at the beginning of our end step, we may pay X. If we do, we draw X cards. X can't be greater than the amount of life we gain this turn. Obviously, she works with herself because she has lifelink, but so does Atraxa. So we're going to be gaining a ton of life. This is probably the best card draw engine in the deck. And then if someone is trying to get rid of our pesky auras and equipments, we have Sun Titan, which actually almost every single permanent in our deck can be brought back with Sun Titan. Sun Titan, if you don't remember, is a 6-mana 6/6 with Vigilance, and when he enters or attacks, we can return a permanent with converted mana cost 3 or less from our graveyard to the battlefield, and again, that hits almost every single permanent in our deck. Similarly, there's a card in here that I have never played before, Court of Ardenvale. I've seen this on Commander Clash a few times. Phil's played it quite a bit, and I'm really impressed with it. I want to give it a try. 4-mana enchantment. When it enters, you become the Monarch, which is awesome. Everyone loves the Monarch, makes games more interesting. At the beginning of your upkeep, return a target permanent card with mana value 3 or less from our graveyard to our hand, but if we're the Monarch, we get to put it onto the battlefield instead. Again, gonna hit almost every single permanent in our deck. Going through the sorceries, we only have 2 board wipes in here because obviously we want to keep our commander around, but we have Damning Verdict, which is 5-mana sorcery, destroy all creatures with no counters on them. That's pretty good. Our opponents probably won't have many, if any, of those. And then we also have Wave Goodbye, which is for 4 mana, return each creature without a +1/+1 counter onto its owner's hand. Not a board wipe in the traditional sense, but it does slow them down quite a bit, makes them have to redeploy, slows them down in turn at least. I'm not going to read them all, but we do have several cards in the deck that also proliferate without having to rely on Atraxa, like Tesserate's Gambit, which draws cards, Unnatural Restoration, which lets us get a permanent back from our graveyard. You get the drill. We're not going to read all of those. Couple interesting mana rocks in the ramp category. Astral Cornucopia, which is an XXX cost artifact that enters with X charge counters on it. So 3 mana would be 1 counter, 6 mana would be 2 counters, and then you can tap it to choose a color, add 1 mana of the chosen color for each charge counter on it. So yeah, it's not a great rate, but if we 3 mana get this down with 1 counter on it, we're probably going to be able to proliferate several times with it and eventually get to the point where it's tapping for absurd amounts of mana. Similarly, there's Everflowing Chalice, which is for 0 mana but has multi-kicker for 2 mana, enters with a number of charge counters on it for each time it was kicked, and then it taps for a colorless for each charge counter on it. The other interesting piece of ramp in this deck is Staff of Completion, which is 3 mana artifact that has a ton of abilities. You can tap it, pay 1 life to destroy target permanent you own. That's not going to happen that often, but I could see niche situations where it might be relevant. Tap, pay 2 mana, add 1 mana of any color. Tap, pay 3 life, proliferate. Tap 4 life, draw a card, and you can pay 5 mana to untap it. Now that sounds like a lot of paying life, but again, Atraxa is going to gain us a ton of life, so hopefully we can get quite a bit of use out of this. A card I kind of forgot about is Finest Hour. This is for 2, a green, a white, and a blue, so 5 mana. It's an enchantment with Exalted, meaning that whenever a creature we control attacks alone, that creature gets +1/+1 until end of turn, and then whenever a creature we control attacks alone, if it's the first combat phase this turn, we untap that creature, and then there's an additional combat phase. Additional combats is a great way to help a Voltron deck close out the game a little bit more efficiently, a little bit faster, and since we don't have access to red, we don't have that many options for extra combat, so Finest Hour I think is actually pretty sweet. We also have Sigarda's Aid, which is for 1 mana, an enchantment that lets us cast auras and equipments as though they had flash, and then when an equipment enters, we can put it onto a creature without having to pay its equip cost. All right, finally, let's talk a little bit about lands. I did not spend a bunch of time putting this land base together because I don't know if I'm going to end up building it in paper or not. I don't know if I'll end up using this list for anything other than this video, so I didn't want to slave over, like, do I play fetches? If I play too many fetches, should I up the total land count so I still have enough lands that tap for actual mana? This deck is already kind of expensive. Do I want to spend even more money making it a super optimized, super fancy deck list? To fill in a bunch of slots, I put in a bunch of basics, and if you're going to stick with that, good luck. You probably need to put more of the at least bad fetch lands in here, maybe put some of more of the basic specific ramping here to make sure that if you're doing that, you are fixing your mana more appropriately. So that all being said, if you were to use this deck list as a starting point for building your own list, I would just say you're probably going to want to build your own mana base with your own budget, with your own preferences. Just do that yourself. But I do have some utility lands in here that I think are worth considering depending on how good you end up getting your mana fixing. First off, we have Ether Hub, which is is enters the battlefield, we get an energy, it taps for a colorless, or we can pay an energy and tap it for 1 mana of any color. So normally this is probably not really worth it. We're not an energy specific deck, unlike my original version of my Atraxa deck. But if we don't need to tap it for colored mana right away, and we can actually proliferate a couple times, we'll end up with enough energy that we can actually use it multiple times for colored mana and not actually worry about it. So in that sense, it's great mana fixing for an untapped land. Cathedral of War is an interesting one. It enters tapped and it has Exalted. So again, if we attack alone with one creature, that creature gets a buff and then it taps for a colorless. So this one, I'm kind of on the fence. It's just kind of a cool card. I don't think it's very good, but it is just kind of cool. We have Command Beacon, which taps for a colorless, or we can tap it, sacrifice it to put a commander into our hand from the command zone. Great way to get around. In case Atraxa's commander tax gets too high, this is a way that we can more realistically cast it and then follow it up with other things. Diamond City, this is the one I'm probably most on the fence about, but it enters with a shield counter on it. If something with a shield counter would be dealt damage or destroyed, you instead remove the shield counter, taps for a colorless, and then you can tap it to remove a shield counter from it to put onto a creature, but you can only activate that if 2 or more creatures enter the battlefield this turn. We don't actually have that many creatures in the deck, so I don't think this is really realistic. But if, like I said, if you built this in a way that had more ores and equipments to have your Pure Steel Paladins and your SRAMs and all of those in there, you probably could get your creature count up high enough that Diamond City would be worth it. We have Forge of Heroes, which taps for a colorless, or we can tap it to choose commander that entered the battlefield this turn and put a +1/+1 counter on it right off the bat, automatically have a little bit of stuff to proliferate. Gavany Township, which taps for a colorless, or we can pay 2, a green and a white to tap it to put a +1/+1 counter on each creature we control. Karn's Bastion, I kind of hate this card, but I feel like you have to play it if you're playing a proliferate deck. Taps for a colorless, or you can pay 4 and tap it to proliferate. Opal Palace taps for a colorless, or you can pay 1, tap it to add 1 mana of any color, and if that mana was spent on your commander, it enters with an additional +1/+1 counter on it for each time you've cast your commander from the command zone this game. So again, not the best way to fix your mana, not the best way to get counters, but it does scale a little bit later into the game. Tyrite Sanctum, which taps for a colorless, or you can pay 2 and tap it to make a legendary creature a god in addition to its other types, and you put a +1/+1 counter on it, and then you can pay 4, tap it, sacrifice it, and put an indestructible counter on a god. And then the last one I want to talk about is Urza Saga. Now, we have a decent amount of artifacts in the deck, so the construct tokens that are potentially going to be able to be made from the Urza Saga could get quite big and could help us stay on defense, help push a little bit more aggression. But I don't put Urza Saga in a deck unless it has several targets for the last chapter, which says search your library for an artifact card with mana cost 0 or 1 to put onto the battlefield and shuffle. I don't put this in decks unless I have multiple targets for it, and those targets are also relevant. And I feel like in this deck, they are. So I think there's 5 in the deck, one of them being Everflowing Chalice, which you wouldn't want to grab because it would enter with 0 counters on it, and then it wouldn't tap or anything. So you don't want to do that. But obviously we have Soul Ring, which, most commander decks will. But the other ones are really good. The Ozolith, which we have talked about, is a great way to make sure that even if our commander is removed, we have something saved to help us rebuild later on in the game. Pip-Boy, which again is one of my favorite equipments. It's just so flexible, gives us so many options. And lastly, the Lost Jite, very similarly, just gives us a lot of options. All right, and that is my version of Voltron Atraxa Praetor's Voice. If you want to see this rough draft of a deck list, you can find a link to that in the description of this video. In there, you can also find any links to any of the other people in this group who has made their own videos for Atraxa, trying to build unique builds of it. If you like this video, make sure you subscribe so you can see all of our other videos as they are coming out. And if you're bored, scroll through and check out some of our other content. More deck techs, podcasts, and gameplay can be found there. I'll see you guys next time.